by no means to like generalize the Pakistani community, but this is kind of from my own experience and the experience of a lot of Bangladeshis, and also like on a very like political scale as well. The fact that genocide denial is so prevalent amongst like the Pakistani community. Growing up, I grew up in an area that was majority Bengali and Pakistanis, um, and on Twitter as well. Like it's honestly disgusting behavior. So like the liberation war was essentially a genocide. Like I don't know if I explained this properly in the first segment, but I kind of talked about how Pakistan's objective was to create a unified Islamic nation, and because Bangladesh had Bangladesh's culture was very intimately linked with Hindu culture. They saw the language and the culture and the people as being very impure and being dirty. And during the war, rape was weaponized basically, because the idea was that they were going to Pakistani soldiers were to rape and impregnate Bangladeshi women so as to purify the bloodline, and where they weren't doing that, they were systemically killing off Bangladeshis. Not even in a way that people are murdered in a war, but with the objective, with the view in mind that Bangladeshis, again, as I keep saying, are impure, they're lowly, like they're scum, basically. Like that was the language, vermin. That was a language that was used a lot. And it was a genocide where millions of people died. The figure is actually contested because Pakistan claimed that it's lower than it is. Bangladesh give a higher figure. But independent kind of like inquiries have put the figure at a few million. I think it's maybe like 2 to 4 million, 3 4 million, which is obviously like horrendous, like everything that happened during the war. And I will go on to talk a little bit about the stories that I've heard and things like that. But when you deep actually what happened to the Bangladeshi people, right? The way that some Pakistani, again, I'm not generalizing, but the way that some Pakistani members react and regard this is absolutely abhorrent. Like yesterday, for example, yesterday it was Bangladesh's 50th birthday. There are some Pakistanis that still refer to us as East Pakistan. They were like, "Oh, happy birthday to East Pakistan. We'll get you one day." It's horrendous. It's so horrendous. They will deny the fact that a systemic genocide took place. There are entire kind of like histories and schools of thought coming from that region and that kind of like history making that are still to this day denying that the genocide took place.
I think as well it's interesting how people like to pick and choose. So people will happily decide, I'm going to criticize Britain for the atrocities that they committed during colonial times, but then they will not acknowledge their own country's wrongdoing.
Yeah,
So it's like,
exactly.
why like what Britain did and the various atrocities that they committed, genocides, massacres, etc., need to be recognised and they need to be apologised for, because they haven't actually apologised for quite a lot of them. But you can't have a go at, well, I mean, I want to tell people what they can do, but it's wrong to have a go about that and then not recognise, wait, but we did bad stuff as well. Like, how can you be in denial about something like that?
Yeah. And the thing is that it makes things really difficult for Bangladesh, because as a nation, what we went through was so traumatic, right? How do you heal? In the aftermath of that, following the bloody birth of the nation, how do you feel? How do you heal? How do you rehabilitate yourself and your people when there is no formal admission of guilt from the perpetrators, right? How is Bangladesh supposed to move on from sexual trauma, genocidal trauma, racial trauma, all of these things when, as I said, we have no rehabilitative space, basically.
So you talked about you went on Twitter and saw some people saying stuff. Have you ever found, like, in person, you've met people who have kind of
Yeah, man.
contested it?
And this is what I talk about when I talk about like Bangladeshis, how the way that Bangladeshis are racialized within the subcontinent, and the unique racism that Bangladeshis are subjected to. Because as I said, I grew up in an area that was predominantly Pakistani and Bengali, and we were racism every day, bro, every day. Like, you guys are dark, you guys are black, you guys are this, you guys are that. Like, you're all dirty, you're all like illiterate, you're all poor. Like, and as kids, like, you hear these things, and oh, like fish eating as well, like
Oh yeah, you know what? I was listening to an interview the other day, and they were talking about obviously about how much fish is used in
yeah,
your cuisine,
yeah,
and they were saying about, oh yeah, like a lot of Bangladeshi kids like just they try to avoid it, and they avoid it like the plague because they're so damaged by the
because you
bullying.
get
Like, oh
bullied
yeah,
for eating
and
fish.
I
Yeah.
was just listening to it, I was just like, what?
Yeah,
Really?
yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah. And you know what? You know what's quite sinister about this though? Like, I know it seems like a very benign thing to like bully someone over, oh, you guys eat fish. But I was just telling Carlos before, I was watching a documentary yesterday about the Liberation War, and it was basically like testaments of people who had been through the war and their experiences. And there was one village where all the women were raped and brutalized, and the ones that did survive, they were given their accounts of what had happened to them, and they were saying that the Pakistani soldiers kept saying to them, "You fish-eating Bengalis." Like, they kept referring to them as like fish-eating Bengalis. So like something as it seems as silly, like
yeah.
as oh, you fish eating, but it's such a like locus of like racism. Like, it's just it's very weird. Like,
And you know, again, it comes back to this idea of like, obviously we think about, for example, like Longside, right, where you
yeah,
grew up. Like, obviously you've talked about the racism that you faced within the overall South Asian community that was quite populated in that area. Meanwhile, people at the top looking around, great, they're bickering amongst each other.
yeah, yeah,
People
yeah,
in
yeah, yeah,
obviously
yeah.
Longside is a quite a
Insular community.
yeah, it's marginalized. It's quite
Yeah.
low economic growth, etc.
Yeah.
Like, it's I'd say it's looked down upon, if I'm being
No,
honest.
no,
I
it
think,
definitely is. It
like,
definitely is.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think the fact that within that the actual South Asian community is like, and again,
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say that there's an equal length of force coming back from the Bangladeshis, but I'm saying
Yeah.
like the fact that people are bickering amongst each other,
Yeah.
and the big man's like playing puppet, like, oh, like,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
fine,
yeah,
you
yeah,
guys
yeah,
like
yeah.
keep arguing, like, in
It's a very
society.
sorry state of affairs.
Yeah, like, we should be like unifying to like, so we can actually like
Yeah.
contest these
Yeah.
forces, and it's sad.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, what needs to happen is that Pakistan needs to formally apologize. Like, and I know the reason why they won't is, and it's the same reason why like Britain will never apologize for colonialism, because what follows the admission of guilt, reparations.
Yeah.
You know, and they're not gonna. But it just makes things very, very difficult, you know, in terms of how to heal as a nation and how to heal as a people. But
Mm.
I mean, talking about healing, so this is the kind of bit that I wanted to talk about next, and this is something that a topic that is really personal to me, because this was what my master's research was on. A lot of like my undergrad research was on this as well. So during the Liberation War, obviously it was a nationwide effort. There are two parts of this that I want to talk about. First of all, I want to talk about the role of women, because obviously the way that one of the foremost tactics that Bangladesh had was guerrilla warfare, and that was, you know, men going away to fight and things like that. But the role of women is often overlooked. So there's a word in Bengali called Birangana, and Birangana means war heroine. And Birangana is the title that Sheikh Mujib, the founder of the nation, bestowed to the 500,000 women that were, by the way, trigger warning, like sexual violence. But Birangana is the title that the founder of the nation bestowed to the 500,000 women that were raped and brutalized during the Liberation War. I spoke very briefly before about the use of rape as a weapon of war, and the way that it was systemically weaponized by the Pakistani army, again because of the ideas of like purifying the bloodline, and it's very interesting as well, this relationship between like gender and nationalism, right? Because the fact that women obviously have the womb, and they are who give birth to the next generation. So women are seen as vessels of nation. The lineage of the nation is intimately tied to the woman's womb, and that's why often like nations are gendered as female. Like Mother India, Mother Bengal, like that's the reason why. So actually, ideologically, the woman's body is kind of like the ideological battleground a lot of the times between kind of like nationalistic wars and things like that. And in this instance, there was a very, very physical and very visceral kind of manifestation of ideology of woman as nation and the woman's body as nation, because as I said, the womb, the Bangladeshi woman's womb was literally weaponized as a weapon of war. And I don't know, it's really messed up. It's really messed up. As I said, like at the minute the kind of figure stands at like 500,000, but again, we will never really know how many women were subject to that kind of abuse. There were rape camps that were set up that women, like Pakistani soldiers, would literally go and rape entire villages, murder the women afterwards. They would kidnap women from villages, from the road, anywhere, like take them to rape camps, brutalize them in the most inhumane ways possible, imaginable. And the thing that is really, really difficult is that because in a culture like Bangladesh's that is quite conservative, the idea of sexual violence it's a techie one because there's a lot of shame surrounding it. So where men who fought in the war and the men whose bodies were brutalized and maimed and hurt during the war, they came out of the war and they were valorized and they were given hero status and things like that. Even though Sheikh Mujib did give the title of Birangana, there was still a lot of shame. Like in the first instance, a lot of women wouldn't admit that they were Birangana because, for example, like you admit it, and then what happens is that you're ostracized because people know that you're a Birangana. That means people know that you have been, sexually abused and raped and brutalized, and then the whole kind of culture of shame and purity comes into it, and then people are like, this woman is an impure woman, and then the woman is ostracized from community. There have been kind of widespread efforts in the aftermath of the war, like rehabilitation centers for women that were raped and things like that. Like, so there have been efforts, but they've just not been good enough, and a lot of that is tied to, as I was saying before, Bangladesh's own culture of sexual conservativeness and things like that. But I don't know, for me personally, that's something that is very, I always try to keep that in mind when I think about the birth of Bangladesh, and I think about what was sacrificed and what was lost, and I think a lot about all the women who went through what they went through, and in the aftermath of it either could not get the recourse to help, were ostracized. Like,
I think as well as that, you also wanted to talk a bit about the various indigenous people and Hindus that also played a part in the.
So obviously, like, the war was a lot of Bengalis, and this is something that I've been thinking a lot as I've gotten older about how history exists and like multiplicities, right? Often we kind of like get one narrative and we stick with that one narrative, but history is very, very messy. So although on the one hand the liberation war was something that a lot of Bangladeshis look at with immense pride and kind of we talk about it in the narrative of like sacrifice and these things, and fighting the good fight. There is also a lot of it. There is also a very dark side of the war, and that is the way, the experience of minorities. Now this, as I said before, is kind of like a very personal subject to me because this is actually what I did my master's thesis on. So my master's thesis was on the experience of indigenous people during the liberation war. So just for a bit of background, Bangladesh is very, very ethnically homogenous. Is 98% Bengali ethnicity in Bangladesh, and it's 2% like indigenous populations basically, but 2% of 160 million is still over 3 million people, right? So they're basically known as like indigenous people because they I mean, I don't know how much I should go into in terms of like indigenous politics, but they're people that basically live in hill areas, particularly in the Chittagong hill tracts in the southeast, but they're also found in various, like in the northwest, in the northeast, like various pockets around Bangladesh. But these people are not ethnically Bengali. They look very, very different. They look almost Southeast Asian. So like there's a lot of racial slurs that are used against them by Bengali people, like Chinese, like like they call them Chinese because they look as I said, Southeast Asian. A majority of them don't have Islam as their native religion, and they don't speak Bangla as their native language. So during the Liberation War, the thing that was difficult was that the entire liberation effort was founded on the basis of Bengali nationalism, right? The idea that we are Bengali people, we speak Bangla language, and therefore we are going to resist against Pakistani imperialism. But what did that mean for the people whose, as I said, weren't ethnically Bengali and whose mother tongue isn't Bangla, but however, they found themselves within the new territory of Bangladesh. They are Bangladeshi, but they're not Bengali. What did that mean for them? Right? But how are they included within this public national consciousness of Bengali nationalism? And God, there's so much to unpack here. It's very, very complex. But from my own research, what I found was that there were it was a very double-sided thing. So there was like an experience that was a unified experience with the Bengali people, and there was an experience that was in contentious with the Bengali people because, as I said before, there's a lot of racism, and it's mental, isn't it? And this is the thing about nationalism. Nationalism always breeds more nationalism because nationalism is inherently exclusionary. We spoke before about how first we were India, right? And then there was regionalism in the sense of like religion. So then we were Pakistan. Okay, and now there's further ethno-linguistic regionalism. So now we want to be Bengali, like Bangladesh. And now there's further ethno-linguistic and religious regionalism. And now there's distinction between Bengali and indigenous people, like there's always like distinctions that are going to be made whenever nationalism is the organizing principle. But anyways, I digress. Yeah, so Bengalis are generally quite racist and exclusionary towards the indigenous people. And during the Liberation War, obviously a lot of indigenous people wanted to fight for Bangladesh because they found themselves within the territory of Bangladesh, and the Pakistanis were even more racist towards them than they were towards the Bengalis, if you thought that couldn't be possible, because at least the Bengalis were Muslim, majority of them, but the indigenous populations, they come from a number of religions. They were Buddhist, they were Hindu, they were Christian, so they had their own indigenous religions as well. So they faced even wider persecution from the Pakistani, regime. So then when they wanted to go up in arms and join the Bengali people, there were a lot of instances where, for example, so the leading party at the time was called the Awami League in Bangladesh. That was Sheikh Mujib's party. They would go to like training camps, right? Indigenous. So they have their own kind of like local villages and local areas and things like that. So they would take up arms, they would go to training camps, and then the people who were running the training camps would turn them away because they would say, you guys are not like ethnically Bengali. And the whole idea was that if they include non-Bengali people in what they believe to be a Bengali fight in the post-liberation period, so when Bangladesh is now an independent nation, they would also have to include those people in imaginations of this national consciousness, which they did not want to do because they were trying to form, in the same way that Pakistan was trying to form a rigid Islamic nation, Bangladesh was trying to form a rigid Bengali nation. So a lot of cases where they were turned away or they were either discriminated against. And what is particularly pertinent as well is in the aftermath of it, so little acknowledgement and celebration and recognition is given to the indigenous people that fought in the war. Like they lost their lives too, they fought for the country too, they were brutalized just the same, if not more, by the Pakistani regime, and Bangladesh has just entirely marginalized them. And this is something that is this also relates to what I was talking about before about the status of the Birangana, right? Where there's this thing in post-liberation war where Mukti Juddho is the word for freedom fighter, right? And the freedom fighter, the Mukti Juddho in Bangladesh, has a very esteemed status. A lot of people, it's like veterans, I guess, like in this country, people are always like, thank you for your service. It's a very similar thing. Like people are very kind of precious about freedom fighters, and you get a lot of like national benefits, so the government provide for you and things like that. A lot of indigenous people and a lot of poor people don't have access to that, because they are deliberately written out of that narrative. Because in some ways, when a nation is made, right, there is a need to valorize that myth of nation making. There is a need to have a kind of polished narrative and rhetoric of how the country was made. This was a Bengali country made for the Bengali people, by the Bengali people. The admission that there were minorities that helped, and this, minorities are spoken specifically about indigenous communities, but also like Hindu people, and massively this documentary that I was talking about that I watched yesterday, it interviewed a lot of poor people, and they were talking about how they fought for the war. And because, they have, Bangladesh is not a bureaucratic country, so there's no like documentation or anything like that. But because they haven't got any access to like government help, they can't prove the fact that they were freedom fighters, and now they're just completely marginalized.
So, on that note, we're gonna have to wrap things up in terms of this segment, play music in a sec. But what do you think Bangladesh as a country needs to do in order to adequately honour and recognise the contributions of the indigenous people and women as well?
First of all, like, abolish nationalism. Like, nationalism is inherently violent. Borders are inherently violent. There is a such thing as pragmatic nationalism, which is what Bangladesh needed during the Liberation War, right? Because we were being attacked. But in the aftermath of it, bro, it needs to be acknowledged. It needs to go. Like, we need to get rid of this idea of Bangladesh as a nation for Bengali people. We need to honor. We need to, first of all, like, the Bengali people need to be educated on the sacrifices made by the indigenous people and the experiences of the indigenous people and other minorities, such as Hindu people, during the Liberation War. And they need rehabilitation in the same way that other freedom fighters have gotten government help and resources. They also need access to those things. A lot of it is history telling as well. We need to tell history the right way, man.
Sure. And it's like, you can't, again, it's just so mad because we criticize white dominated institutions such as academia in general for not considering different sides of things, but then in some ways we as people of colour, brown people, South Asians, etc., we are just as guilty of that.
And that's the thing about nationalism, guys. Nationalism is inherently exclusionary, is inherently violent, because the dominant group, the majority group, will always marginalise. It rests on that marginalisation. In order for you to form the hegemony, there needs to be a counterpart marginalised community. So abolish nationalism.
You heard it here first. Well, you probably didn't hear it here first, guys, but there you go.